So, after you'd come back and nearly thrown your career into confusion by writing an honest book about your fieldwork, and your supervisor was washing his hands of you, more or less.
Definitely.
How did you proceed? I mean, did you get a postdoc, or did you get a position? Or?
I had a position in New York. This is 1971. There were seemingly many jobs around, and again, being poorly socialized, I never really paid terribly much attention to the forms, and I had written my thesis in New York. I didn't go back to Chicago. I wrote my thesis on St. Mark's Place, living about 3 houses down from Auden.
Gosh.
And perhaps in a rather different lifestyle and degree of comfort, but so I took a job at an experimental school in New York City as part of the City University without thinking about it very much. It was amusing for a while, and then I spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Study, which turned out to be in some ways quite a momentous year. I had very little to do with Cliff, but Robert Bellow was there that year, and although it was a very complicated and tragic year for him, first of all, Cliff proposed him for a professorship there, and the mathematicians and others turned it down, so it was very ugly and very unpleasant. And then also one of his daughters committed suicide, so it was, very, very fraught. But he was friendly, and eventually that turned out to be a very important avenue of development for me. But also Pierre Bourdieu was there that year, and particularly in the beginning, he didn't really speak English very well. And we spent an enormous amount of time together talking and getting to know each other, and he outlined in great detail how he was going to get into the Collège de France and the entire sociology of the French field in every possible dimension, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do, and it worked exactly how he said it was going to work. So that was kind of the next wave of French intellectual connection after Dumont and before Foucault. So, but very important in that what was going on in French sociology and social sciences and where he thought things were going and what have you. So that was very important. And then I went back to New York, and then the fiscal crisis of those days hit, and what had been an experimental school and fun stopped being very experimental and stopped being very fun. So Bella ran a seminar, National Endowment of Humanities seminar in Berkeley, and he accepted me in, and that kind of was the turning point, which again I'll talk about briefly this afternoon, where he helped me get the book published, where I met Hubert Dreyfus, where a whole range of other connections opened up, and I discovered California, which then, and to a lesser degree, but still somewhat today, seems like an exotic and foreign land, with many joys and some other weirdness. So I think that, I know that was the next development, and that led into Dreyfus really was a great teacher, and is a master and totally obsessed with Heidegger, so I learned a great deal about Heidegger and in a different way about Wittgenstein at that point. And that set the scene, as it were, for the entry of Foucault into the picture. I mean, that was the immediate preparation for what was going on. I got a job at Berkeley during those years. They wanted a Chicago anthropologist, so I was competing against several of my classmates, and things worked out. So there are several lines help me here. Either the anthropology department, which is less to say about, or the Foucault Dreyfus connection.
Well, we've started with Bourdieu, so let's pursue. What was Bourdieu like?
He was, unlike Dumont, he was a very, very overtly passionate and direct person. I mean, he was not a small-talking, casual guy. He was very strong and very deeply engaged with everything he did, including hatreds and competitions and opinions and what have you, which I rather liked. And but he also demanded a loyalty after a while, and that became a bit of an issue. But he, I often compare him to any number of French novels, but the sentimental education of Flaubert is really, or The Red and the Black in a different way, is really Bourdieu. Self-styled provincial, mythologized his marginality and his provinciality, comes to Paris because he works through his intelligence, fights his way to the top, increasingly powerful and influential and increasingly unhappy in many ways. An extremely intense and brilliant character, but one who really, truly wanted power and recognition in a way that I don't think I know anyone else who desired it as much and was overtly conscious of plotting and strategizing to achieve it. And having achieved it, there was always, of course, more. And then, again, like in so many of these French novels, convinced that when he reached all these summits and still wasn't happy or didn't feel fully like everyone bowed down in awe when he walked down the hall, had got fairly paranoid about what the reasons for that. So increasingly in his latter years, when he got more and more militantly, stridently political, I saw him less, and didn't share his politics, and also his approach to intellectual life, which had been very different before that, but then it just increasingly became, he was right about everything. Dumont had some of that too, but Bourdieu wasn't just like a personality trait. He would argue at length about anything and why he was right, and everyone else was wrong, and that was kind of boring.
Talking of these powerful personalities, you were going to tell me an Edmund Leach anecdote.
There was a Winter Gren conference in Fez, and we were in this extremely luxurious setting overlooking Fez, with the call to prayer periodically and a beautiful day and the mosques quite visible. And this was a conference in which there were very distinguished senior people, Leach, Gertz, Solons in particular, and then a range of sort of younger people. And so the conference was sort of Gertz and Solons fighting with each other. And by the second day, Leach turned his back to the table, and he was ill at this point with visible head lesions, and faced out this beautiful perspective over Fez, read the newspaper, and periodically swivel back in the chair and say, "It's rubbish, it's all rubbish," and then swivel back and look. No one knew what to do, so they basically ignored it. And then Sherry Ortner, as is her wont, tried to mediate this obviously impossible situation. And so what happened was, she started to do that, so everyone turned on her, and so it was a difficult event. But the memory that sticks with me is Leach absolutely expressing his contempt for the whole thing.
I'll tell you afterwards a similar story, but Well, let's move on then to your Wikipedia entry, which says that above all you are famous for your close attention and scholarship on Foucault. So tell us that story.
Right. I had heard of Foucault, of course, before, but was never very interested in his work. And Dreyfus and Sir John Searle and I had talked a lot. And my first year at Berkeley, Searle and Dreyfus were giving a seminar on Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Foucault, and Derrida. And I was a participant in the seminar. And this was the time when Searle and Derrida were yelling at each other, and which didn't interest me very much. But Dreyfus and Searle interpreted Foucault as a structuralist, which I didn't care, but I didn't think was right. So we started talking about that, particularly Dreyfus and I. Although Searle and Foucault were always actually fairly good friends. And we decided to write an article together. I began to convince Bert that, at the very least, what he was saying had to be nuanced and made a little bit more complicated. And at that point, someone mentioned that Foucault was coming to Stanford. Or as my wife reminds me, it's correct English to say, Foucault was going to Stanford. Thank you, Marilyn. So being a New Yorker, I said, well, why don't we just call him up and ask him whether you're right or I'm right, and we can talk about this some more, you know. And so I called him up, and he agreed to talk to us, and we picked him up at the hotel in San Francisco and drove him down to Stanford. And Dreyfus tape records absolutely everything he does in his entire life, because he claims not to have a memory, and he thinks he's a computer, and or some kind of cyborg in any case. So that opened this discussion where we spent 8 hours that day talking to him. And I've written an article about this, which I go on in somewhat more detail. It's not published yet, but it will be. In which basically Foucault, like Bourdieu, like Dumont, had no one to talk to. This is very strong in France, that the boundaries of who you actually can talk to and confide in are extremely rigorously policed and very isolating them the higher you go. And Foucault was keenly suffering from this. So here are these two little Jewish guys, who neither of whom were too particularly interested in his work, and neither of whom were certainly disciples, and neither of whom particularly had any stakes in the matter, but thought he was confused about some things and needed to clarify some stuff, and he just responded extraordinarily well, because it was just a gift for him to actually be able to engage in discussion without being so guarded. So as he said once, in Paris, if you say you're talking about the Enlightenment, the one thing you can be sure of is that's not what you're talking about. Whereas in Berkeley, and this is a little bit the trope of the, you know, California as the happy natives, people say they're talking about the Enlightenment, they're talking about the Enlightenment. So there developed a very strong intellectual connection in which he really needed that. Foucault really needed this sort of exchange. And with this kind of stake at that point. And then my first wife, I've only had two, and I became good friends with Foucault and Foucault's partner, Daniel Defer, and spent a year and a half in Paris at that point, in which we ate together and spent time together. And then Foucault was coming back to Berkeley regularly and intended to come back to Berkeley each year. Unfortunately, then he got ill and died very suddenly, very rapidly. During the course of these discussions, the structuralism issue fell away, and another range of way of putting together rigorous concept work with detailed empirical work began to be exciting to me. I mean, that's to me what I like about anthropology and why I'm an anthropologist, not a philosopher, but very few, if any, philosophers ever put the two together. So Heidegger, no. Wittgenstein, no. John Searle, no, etc. Foucault really exemplified, it seems to me, the real turn that philosophic thinking in modernity, one way of taking that up in any case. But also, since what he was doing and what I was doing was never the same, and because he was a very complicated human being, it was also it was possible to work alongside him and also to be independent at the same time. So that became a tremendous turning point for me, and among other things enabled me to turn the fact that I didn't want to go to Morocco. I was attempting to go to Vietnam, as again I'll mention briefly today, and during this period of time and with these discussions with Foucault, I began to be able to think about a conceptual framework which would be a kind of archaeological history of the present, and French modern is sort of my example of this work. So I continue to think he's a very, very great thinker, but I also continue to think that what he did was what he did. It had its limits, and there are many other things to do that he didn't do. So much of the Foucault literature I don't read, but what little of it I read, when my students tell me about, I find wrong, especially British literature, I might add. Governmentality literature, I think, is dreadfully wrong. And many, many things continue to be opened up by Foucault. So again, like McKeon, I had great influence, but not impossible for me, in any case, to be a disciple. And that's the position that I want. And Foucault also wanted that, as McKeon said he wanted that, whether he did or not, I don't know. But Foucault certainly wanted people to govern themselves. And it was very hard to take that seriously because he was so overpowering and brilliant. Bourdieu wanted you to be part of his state. Foucault hated that. And hence that suited me. So I've continued with that as one of the things that I do, not the only thing. Is that helpful? Or is that
it is very helpful. I mean, just two very quick things,
sure,
because
please.
one could have a whole. One is McEwan, you didn't actually like very much. I mean, you admired him and so on, but did you like Foucault? Was he someone you could say whether you liked him or not? I mean, as a person, he was a homosexual, wasn't he? And
he was a very unhappy, deeply private man. He was an extremely kind man, in a way that many others weren't. He was very attentive to small human things. And hence he was always, at that level, was always comfortable being around him. He cooked for us, and he... On the other hand, you always had a sense that he was somewhere else. He was also in this period, I'm writing this piece for Theory, Culture, and Society, which I can send you. He was quasi-suicidal during these years. He was deeply in the process of changing his thought. His relationship with Danielle was not good. So was I close to him? I think probably not. And also, since I wasn't a homosexual, and one of his great lines is, I love San Francisco because there are so many gays and I am a homosexual. And but he was a but on the other hand, yes, I was I deeply fond of him.
If you had to convince someone in about 2 minutes, like myself, who's a great skeptic about Foucault, why he's a great thinker, for at least for anthropologists, why he's important for anthropologists, how would you?
I think the two lines are at some level very simple and very complicated to explain. I think if you buy the argument that with Heidegger and Wittgenstein, traditional Western metaphysics was over, then philosophy, those people who wanted to continue to do philosophy, or better, to lead a philosophic life, had to figure out a different form of leading that life. Richard Rorty tried and didn't know how to do it, because most philosophers can only do traditional philosophy, even though they know that that tradition is over. So Foucault is, on the one hand, figured out a different way of doing, I think, leading a philosophic life, which included, and this is the anthropological part, a Nietzschean but also anthropological attention to detail, and in his case, historical archaeological detail. But he spent his life not arguing concepts with people, but working through material. And his books are the idea that Foucault, there are no actors and all this stuff. You read these books, and including some of the lectures, later lectures, which are absolutely magnificent in my view, their engagement with detailed historical context, with options and constraints, with settings and milieu, and it's that combination of attention to detail and context combined with a passion for conceptual clarification and work, which seems to me unique. Dumont, you knew what his theory was, and he did wonderful things with it. Bourdieu, theory, examples. And Foucault developed a very different relation between theory and examples. I don't think he had any theory. I know he didn't have any theory. So this is in the Canguilhem tradition of concepts, experiments, and results, which then become problems. And I think that very few of the Foucault followers, if one judged Foucault by his followers, like many thinkers, it's fairly disastrous. But for me, this was a philosophic life, and in many ways a deep anthropological life, always engaged outward while thinking all the time. So that would be the short version. And hence, one would need to read those books, and particularly the lectures. The recent lectures are very helpful, as examples of experiences and experiments rather than theory or doctrine or epical diagnosis or the usual things that are said about Foucault, all of which I could argue at length are really wrong. No one listens to me, but it's okay. My students listen.
They have to. Well, that's very interesting. I'll try again maybe. Let's move on to your subsequent work. I mean, a lot of it has been on the borderline with science, and as you mentioned recently, molecular biology. How did you get interested in all that, and tell us about it?
French modern took the category society and nominalized it. It showed that what was taken to be a universal, all human groups are society, or have a society, or can be analyzed as having a society, had a history to where the term emerged in the cholera epidemics of the 1830s, and then was involved in long, complicated elaborations in pragmatic and political contexts. The next set of projects was suggested by Canguilhem and was to take the term life. George Canguilhem.
Oh yes, can you spell it for us?
Canguilhem. Right. The great French historian of science, and particularly the life sciences. So the idea was to take life as the similar kind of concept, not history of ideas, but as a practice and as a knowledge production venue, and to look at that point at the emerging genomic sciences, which were clearly transforming the biological understanding of what life was, but to do it in detail in terms of where this knowledge was being produced, how it was being produced, and then to a lesser degree, how it was circulating. And that's what I've continued to do, although the shift now is from life to anthropos. So at the end of the game, I'm an anthropologist, and for me, that's a question of anthropos, which in Greek is the human thing, and logoi. And it's, as we've been, one way of characterizing what I've been saying is that anthropos is that being who lives through logoi, but many logoi, lives through logos, but through many logoi, and hence there's an essential...
Describe logoi or logos as your...
Logos or logoi are...
the word, isn't it? Logos? Or...
It's a Greek word meaning both speech and truth. So these are truth claims. So we understand ourselves, not everybody to the same degree, obviously, but we understand ourselves as beings who say true things about ourselves and about the way we and others live. And that seems to me one form, at least, of what anthropology is. And currently, one of the main groupings of logoi which tell us who we really are the biosciences. So I'm not interested in the truth claims per se, the biosciences, like Dawkins and others, but in the way that shapes us as human beings. So I'm an anthropologist of anthropos, as it were, and logoi. And that's currently what I'm involved in and interested in doing. And this leads to, I'm currently working in synthetic biology, and I'm interested in how synthetic biology and synthetic anthropos are converging or might converge or could come together in various arts and techniques which are going to form, like YouTube and the rest of which are going to a degree, form how we understand ourselves and who we are and how we will shape the environments that we work in, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a kind of long trajectory there, which at greater length has some coherence to it, I believe. And again, I think Foucault provided tools to do history of the present, but wasn't an anthropologist and wasn't actually ever primarily interested, and certainly never wrote about contemporary reality per se. He always stopped, usually around 1840. So the question for the rest of us then is, well, what is anthropology if it's not that? And there are many answers to that. But I'm trying to articulate one version of what that might look like, with again this combination of reflective and conceptual work with deep commitment to empirical, being close to the practices going on in the world, not just in discourse. And that's, to me, the anthropological ethic is to be out rather than in, as it were.
Two ways of drawing that out a little bit. One is, how does this differ from science and technology studies, from the work of René Latour and John Law and laboratory science work?
Right. It's both very close and very far. Bruno has substituted one theory for another theory. So he and Bourdieu hated each other, and they hated each other because, among other reasons, Bourdieu thought the universal category was society. Latour has argued thousands of pages, no, it's actor networked. there is no society, a society is an actor network. But he has a single universal answer for everything that's going on. He does it brilliantly, and I mean that in a genuine sense. It's also, to me, totally boring, because after you know the moves, nothing new really emerges on the one hand. And this is related to a degree to his mode of production, as it were. Bruno worked in the École des Mines for many years. Very theoretical. Then they had contracts where they would do short-term field work and write a report. So he developed a methodology which works extremely well for that. So that's one side, that it's too pat. It's a theory. It's not concept work. John Law I have respect for, but he and a lot of other people in science studies have an ironic attitude towards science, which I don't share. I think it's an unearned and false distance. And I think we're in the most exciting period of understanding living beings since Darwin, and that I'm not looking to be distant from it. I'm looking to understand it, to protect and promote enlightenment, which is under attack in the United States and in many other places. But then also to think about it in a second-order way. So I think many of the science and technology studies, much of that work is interesting, but I don't share the project. And if that crew, the person I'm closest to is Chapin. And we've had very good...
Stephen Chapin.
Stephen Chapin. We've had very good discussions, and his new book, which came out a month or two ago, is somewhat of a product of our discussions and his...
What is that book called? Do you remember?
I don't know the title since I was involved in so many versions of it, but it's basically biotechnology and science as a vocation in the 20th century. And a kind of detailed study of the changing position of the scientist and the moral credibility of the scientist, and how that shifted in the 20th century. Excellent piece of work.
The second question is, how do you practice this kind of anthropology? What do you do? I notice you've set up a number of centres and institutes and so on. It's always struck me as difficult to imagine what it is. I have friends like Georgina Borna and others who've worked in laboratories, but it does seem very difficult. It's very different from the traditional anthropological field work.
Right.
But how do you do your studies? Do you talk to them? Do you live with them? Do you?
Both. Two framing ideas. George Marcus and I have been talking for some time. We actually have a book that's coming out any day now of conversations around the fact that there's a space between laboratory, say biological laboratories, and architectural or artistic design studios, in which collective criticism of individual projects has been articulated and developed, which allows something like ferocious criticism that's depersonalized and enables collective work to go forward. I think this is one of the great inventions of the biosciences, and Chapin's social history of truth is some of it, but there's actually not a history of lab meetings, for instance, which I think are an extremely important technology, or a history of the critique studios.
You know, June Goodfield, I think it's June Goodfield, who wrote about development of science. I'll tell you about it afterwards. But
that would be wonderful.
It's an account of how observation over a couple of years of a scientific experiment. But anyway, it's sort of talked about the lab meetings a bit, but not much, yeah.
Very important. So somewhere in between, it seems to me, the human sciences, and anthropology in particular, it seems should be trying to articulate ways that we can both work on individual projects, but work critically in a collaborative sense and develop venues in which a certain form of criticism, which would enrich multiple projects, could go on without it becoming the Bourdieu or the Gertz sort of, if you don't agree with me on everything, you're out, or what have you. Given that careers are still individual, and given that careers in the human sciences are still, as opposed to the biosciences, are still based on individual publications, this is a dilemma, although I think the days of that are not going to continue very much longer as the monograph disappears, as the publication, etc. So I'm interested in trying to develop venues in which a form of collaborative work can go on. And it has the self-formative and pedagogical dimension that I've talked about on the one hand, but also the kind of objects and projects that we're interested in. First of all, their temporality and their complexity is such that the more traditional anthropological methods simply need to be modified if we're going to continue as a relevant discipline in the 21st century. So broadly speaking, that's what I'm intending to do. So of course there's some observation and personal contact, but it's not, I don't do any more laboratory studies. And now I'm actually a principal investigator in the Synthetic Biology Center, so I have a different relationship there as well.
I think we're coming towards the end, but I'm trying to think. We talked about religion. We haven't talked much about politics, but you've alluded to the fact that you think of yourself as a non-Marxist, leftish sort of person.
Right.
Are there other things which you would like me to have asked you about or talked about that I've missed out?
I think it's extremely important to defend learning. Sounds like a strange thing to say, but I think that, and in many ways, of course, in the United States, there are pressures, vastly anti-intellectual currents and pressures, but in the UK as well, as Marilyn Strathern and others have shown us, the pressures of audit society, of instrumental, immediate instrumental implications of one's work, relevance and the rest, I think need to be resisted. And so one of my politics, I have a kind of politics of truth, which is attempting to also to convince some of the scientists that they're much more vulnerable than they think they are. And that if the university is going to reinvent itself as a place of somewhat disinterested learning, which I think is absolutely precious, that we need to do it, to defend this in a more articulate fashion. I think if you look around for defenses of science, you'll find very few of them. So I was at a meeting with Phil Campbell, the editor of Nature, and a number of other people, and people get up and give eloquent speeches about here's science and here's society and we have the truth and then there's the stuff outside. It's not true. And so if I have a cause, it's kind of some kind of cosmopolitan enlightened curiosity and defense of venues which will make that flourish in the 21st century.
Do you feel Berkeley is a place that does it?
I feel Berkeley is a great research university. The University of Chicago was a great university. Berkeley is not a great university. Pedagogy and teaching and learning are not central at Berkeley. One can do it, but for instance, I have to fight for a classroom if I want to teach for 3 hours instead of 2 hours. And there's no overall curriculum, and hence there's no deep Wissenschaft. So no, I don't think Berkeley's a great university.
You don't mind us going on to YouTube?
I say this all the time.
Okay. Well, anything else? So that's very important. But
thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk.